Welcome to the Historical Heartbeats Lecture Series event. This is the 4th annual Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson Cyril Packwood Memorial Lecture. Tonight's lecture is Central Africans and the Dynamics of Afro-Bermudian Society, 1615 to 1700. And please join me in welcoming my permanent secretary, the Permanent Secretary of Culture, Social Rehabilitation, Mr. Wayne Carey.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is my distinct honor to introduce to you this evening the Honorable Dean Aletha I. Butterfield, MBE, JP, MP, who will bring opening remarks. And Mrs. Minister Butterfield is, of course, very familiar to all of us. She held the portfolio of the Ministry of the Environment, and also later the Ministry of Environment, Telecommunications and E-Commerce. And now, of course, Minister Butterfield has the portfolio for the Ministry of Culture and Social Rehabilitation. Please welcome Minister Butterfield. Be honored.
Carrie.
Let me first say thank you to my wonderful PS. It's amazing, and many of you believe in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It's wonderful how the Spirit moves. He was my PS for the Ministry of the Environment, and he was also my PS for the Ministry of the Environment, Telecommunications, and E-Commerce. And then when I was appointed to be the Minister of Culture and Social Rehabilitation, he was also the PS there. So something saying something to me. And we do have a wonderful relationship, so thank you for that. He gave me a nickname when I was in the Ministry of Telecommunications and E-Commerce, and I hope you get it right, because after 2 years of not being in cabinet, your mind goes elsewhere to do other things. And I believe it was open space, outer space, and cyberspace, 3 different ministries. I don't know what he's going to tell me on this one, because we're just settling down. 400 years of celebration takes up a lot of time, and we want to commend all of those that are doing all of these things. So I think it's very, very exciting that we can come together and listen. So I'm going to say good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, members of the Robinson family, the Packwood families. Good evening to all, and thank you all for joining us tonight. This is the 4th annual Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson Cyril Packwood Memorial Lecture, organized in a way of recognizing the contributions of these 2 significant Bermudian historians. This year, we honor these trailblazers by sponsoring a lecture by 2 eminent guest scholars, Dr. Linda Haywood, please stand, and Dr. John Thornton. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Haywood and Dr. Thornton, who were kind enough to visit and offer a lecture on this occasion. Tonight's lecture by these 2 prominent historians from Boston University is particularly appropriate during Bermuda's commemorative year. As we think about how our island home has developed over the past 400 years, it is inevitable that we consider origins, root cultures, and the seeds of heritage that managed to take root on this island and grow. Dr. Thornton and Dr. Haywood's research allows us to explore these ideas with a greater understanding of our history that is partially ours, but that is also greater than us. The details of this history help to describe and educate us about our African ancestry and our relationship with the entire African diaspora. As the Minister of Culture and Social Rehabilitation, it is my hope that by learning more about the history and cultures that have shaped and influenced us as a people, we can better understand both ourselves and our community. I would like to thank the members of the Historical Heartbeats Committee and the staff of the Department of Community and Culture Affairs for organizing this program. And we look forward to an enjoyable and educational evening. Let me say at this point, it is going to be enjoyable, and it is going to be educational. I had the pleasure of sitting with them for dinner last night, and I did speak with Dr. Haven in terms of my role in the Commonwealth, and I'm on the executive in the Caribbean Atlantis area. And I told her I had visited over 12 different Caribbean countries, and we just got so excited as we talked about each one of them. Each one of us knew something about Dominica or Jamaica and Barbados, and I had just come back from Guyana. So it was really, really interesting, the connections that we have. And we could say, gee, those British did go from place to place and leave some stamps and things for us to talk about. So it is going to be enjoyable. It is going to be educational. I hope some of you either have a little notepad. I bought mine because I'm going to make some notes and just keep some points inside of your head. It's going to be exciting, interesting, and I can guarantee you that you're going to be doing some research yourselves, because everywhere I travel in the Caribbean, someone says, you look like somebody I know. I was just at a 100th birthday for Mrs. Dill, who attends my church, and as soon as I sat down, the girl says, you must go to Jamaica a lot because someone says, I look like you. And that was just last week. So in our travels, there's so much to know, and I think you're all going to be excited. You're going to leave here not only talking at your workplace, but we tend to email, we tend to talk on the telephone, we tend to do a lot of conversational things, and you're going to leave here with some great conversations about your ancestry. So enjoy it, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Butterfield. This is the Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson Cyril Packwood Memorial Lecture, and so each year we invite members of the Robinson and Packwood family to present on these two historians who've been a part of their family and who have contributed so much to Bermuda. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Mrs. Rosalind Robinson, as well as Mrs. Shirley Pearman. And Mrs. Pearman is going to give a presentation on Dr. Robinson, her father. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Protocol has been established, and I shall continue. It is my pleasure to share with you information on my late father, Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson, OBE, BSc, EDM, EDD, which was printed in the Bermudian Heritage Association February 2008 Black History Month calendar. If you're familiar with that calendar, you know that it was quite an excellent effort in terms of bringing at least 28 individuals onto our radar. But this evening I'll read about my father. Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson was born May 29th, 1911. He was the only child of nurturing parents Hilton and Olivia Robinson. The family home overlooked Pembroke Marsh and was in close proximity to Government Gate. Music and books were his lifelong passion. Prior to attending university in the United Kingdom, he was an organist at his neighborhood church, St. Monica's Mission. As a boy in the 1920s, he could hardly have grown up in that neighborhood and not been exposed to the gumbays. He participated as a fife player in a troupe, and it was some 50 years later when he received the Warrior Hatchet at the first Gumbay Award ceremony at City Hall. It was an honor that pleased him as a mature man. Dr. Robinson commenced his secondary school education at the Berkeley Institute. Upon the completion of his secondary education at the Excelsior Secondary School, he was awarded the Bermuda Technical Scholarship, reserved for boys of color. He was 19 years of age in 1931 when he traveled by boat to the UK to attend University College of London. It was with the expectation of studying law that he left his island home, and the intention was that he would equip himself to address the inequalities which existed in the Bermuda of the 1930s. Studying in London and on the continent was a transforming experience which changed the course of his life. He graduated in 1936 with a Bachelor of Science honors degree. He had commenced a journey of personal educational development which would equip him to enhance the educational pursuits and possibilities of the people in his homeland, Bermuda. Exposed to and in sync with the tempo of the times, his resolve was to address the entrenched inequalities which existed through education. He returned to the UK, and in 1938 he obtained the Diploma of Education from the Institute of Education, London University. At considerable sacrifice and aspiring to attain educational credentials which could not be challenged or disputed, he embarked on studies at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA. He was successful in the Master of Education and Administration degree in 1949, and in 1952 had the distinction of being the first Bermudian to attain a Doctorate in Education degree. The linchpin of his reason for being in place, he was now more than adequately equipped to serve the people of Bermuda. Some 46 years later, the tribute was paid that he, quote, viewed education as the means to gain intellectual emancipation, and the tool for his quest was universal literacy, close quote. Dr. Robinson's career path was conducted simultaneously with his studies, historical research, and the rearing of his family. Married to Rosalind, my mother, Neeb Taylor, he was the father of 2 children, myself, Shirley, and Kenneth, and the proud grandfather of Scott, Michael, Kenneth, Kalila, and Jana. Dr. Robinson was a member of the Berkeley Educational Society for more than 40 years and held the office of curator historian. His 1962 publication, The Berkeley Educational Society's Origins and Early History, was published during his tenure. As a scholar, he authored numerous professional and historical papers. As a proponent of Bermudianized educational material, he created and designed a mathematics curriculum specifically for the Bermuda primary schools. In the Bermuda Atlas and School Map, which he designed, he was the first to illustrate, open quotes, the origins of Bermuda's chief peoples, close quote. In 1970, he facilitated the revolutionary Sesame Street program being introduced to preschoolers. And in 1970, he responded to and endorsed the need for Black studies in the curriculum. His advocacy of the latter was vetoed. Dr. Robinson's signature work, Heritage, was arduously researched in his quote-unquote free time over a 20-year period. It is a text replete with primary sources and was intended to be the first of a 4-part study of the achievements and contributions of people of color in Bermuda, of course, in the 100 years post-emancipation Bermuda. Heritage was published posthumously in 1979, a year after his death in 1978. Those who knew Dr. Robinson recognized him as a visionary and selfless person who was decisive and articulate, but not without humor and charm. A gentleman in every sense of the word, he respectfully doffed his hat and exhibited a cordial disposition. In championing a cause, however, He was a formidable adversary. He was a man of intellect and a man of integrity. The family is pleased to be associated with the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs annual Robinson Packwood Memorial Lecture. Thank you for listening. Each year I try to present a different aspect of my father's being. Thank you.
On behalf of the Department of Cultural Affairs, I'd like to present you this booklet of flowers on behalf of your father's work. Let me assure you that on the schedule of the Bermuda schools, there is a holiday for him, and I don't know, I know teachers look at that, but we need to celebrate him more with that. So I can assure you that the other hat that I wear, we not only allow the students to read the books, but we highlight why they have a holiday that day. And I'm praying that it will happen.
I appreciate that, not just so much for my father, but you know, we spent a lot of time talking about our heroes and folks making a contribution. And having done so, it's nice for them to have the opportunity to be known by the next generation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Pearman. On behalf of the Packwood family, I would like to share with you a brief biography of Cyril Outerbridge Packwood. He was born in Bermuda on the 22nd of November, 1930, and spent his early childhood in Wellington, St. George's. He was educated at East End School, Temperance Hall, and the Berkeley Institute before going abroad in 1946. He earned a BA in history from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee in 1953, and the next year a Master of Science degree in Library Science from Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Years later, in 1972, he was awarded an MA degree in history from Hunter College of the City University of New York. His professional experiences were gained in the New York Public Library from 1957 to 1968, and the Borough of Manhattan Community College Library in New York City from 1968 to 1985. He served as head librarian of the Bermuda Library from 1985 until his retirement in September of 1993. Mr. Packwood is the author of Detour, Bermuda, Destination, U.S. House of Representatives, The Life of Joseph Rainey, published in 1977, and of course, his seminal work, Chained on the Rock, published in 1975. At this time, I would like to welcome and introduce our two eminent scholars, Dr. Linda Haywood and Dr. John Thornton. Dr. Linda Haywood is the author of Contested Power in Angola, editor and contributor to Central African's Cultural Transformations in the American Diaspora, and co-author with John Thornton of Central Africans, Atlantic Creoles, and the Foundation of the Americas, published by Cambridge University Press in July 2007. Her articles on Angola and the African diaspora have appeared in the Journal of African History, the Journal of Modern African Studies, Slavery and Abolition, and the Journal of Southern African Studies. She has served as consultant for numerous museum exhibitions, including African Voices at the Smithsonian Institute, Against Human Dignity, sponsored by the Maritime Museum, and the new exhibit at Jamestown, Virginia. She was also one of the history consultants and appeared in the PBS series African American Lives in 2006 and Finding Oprah's Roots in 2007. Dr. John Thornton, after having taught at Millersville University since 1986, Dr. John Thornton joined the Boston University faculty in fall 2003. His specializations include Africa and the Middle East, as well as world history. He is the author of Kingdom of the Congo, Civil War and Transition, 1641 to 1718, Africa and Africans in the Formation of the Atlantic World, 1400 to 1680. The Congolese St. Anthony, Donna Beatriz Kimpavita and the Antonian Movement, 1684 to 1706. Warfare in Atlantic Africa, 1500 to 1800, and is now working with Dr. Linda Haywood on Angolans in the early Anglo-Dutch Atlantic, 1615 to 1650, under contract with Cambridge University Press. It's published now. Fantastic. Wonderful. Excellent. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Haywood and Dr. John Thornton.
Secretary Terry, members of the Robinson and Packwood families, and Dr. Tismont Robinson for inviting us here and getting us the opportunity to share research which we actually began here in Bermuda. Our first stop when we decided to write this book was the archives here in Bermuda. And we came here in 2000 for that purpose and stayed for, I don't know, a week or 10 days or so working in the archives here. I can't think that we had a more pleasant research experience during the course of our subsequent 7 years of work on the book. But in any case, it's where we started here, and we're so glad to be able to come back here and to talk about what we found, because when we came here, we really didn't know, I won't say we didn't know what we were doing, but we didn't know where it was going to lead us and what we were going to come up with. And so what you're going to see tonight is essentially the results of that research as it applies to the island of Bermuda. Our book actually covers all the English and Dutch colonies that were founded in the early 17th century. We thought about doing the French as well because their pattern is very similar, but we thought we could stick with just the two connected countries. So our fundamental research question really is how did Africans first come to Bermuda? Now, I should point out, if people are not probably aware of this, that neither the English nor the Dutch were engaged in the slave trade in any systematic way in the late 16th or early 17th century. That particular branch of commerce was entirely monopolized by Portugal. No other European power had regular relations with African powers, was involved in African wars the way the Portuguese were. We know that the Dutch, for example, and the English were trading in Africa in the late 16th century and early 17th century, but interestingly enough, they were not purchasing slaves. We located a record of all the Dutch voyages, and the English really did everything that the Dutch did. They really worked together a lot. All the Dutch voyages conducted to Africa from 1621 to 1636, purchasing ivory and textiles and gold. Not one slave was purchased by any of those ships. Instead, the English and the Dutch acquired slaves, which they certainly did, by pirating them from the Portuguese. And this first illustration we have here is a contemporary engraving of a Portuguese vessel. This is not necessarily a slave ship, although we can imagine it was. Slave ships would have looked like that pretty much. And essentially what they did was they attacked Portuguese vessels on the high seas, usually close to the Caribbean, and pirated off their cargoes. That was the virtually universal way of acquiring slaves until the English became involved in the slave trade in 1641 and the Dutch in 1638. So for that early formative period, we're not talking about capturing people in Africa or acquiring them by trade. That's entirely, the people they were capturing it from were the Portuguese. This is why I love this picture. This is an English privateer, we'd like to think it is. Actually, the English Navy in the 17th century, in the late 16th and early 17th century, was pretty much composed of private vessels owned by merchants. There were some royal vessels, but an awful lot of them were private merchant vessels that carried a letter of marque, which was permission to capture and take enemy vessels and to acquire a share of the value of that commodity. The English and the Dutch became involved in this particular activity on a big scale in 1585 as a result of the wars over the Netherlands between the emerging Dutch Republic, its English allies, and the Spanish who were attempting to hold on to that territory. And as a part of the land war, there was also a sea war, which was less systematic, but was largely directed at Spanish commerce. The goal was always to capture the Spanish silver fleet. If you could do that, basically to an army operating in the 16th or 17th century, Money was what oil would be to an army today. And armies ground to the halt if they ran out of money. And therefore, if you could capture the Silver Fleet, this would make a difference in the war. But even if you couldn't do that, if you could just put financial, commercial damage onto Spain, that might tip the scales of battle. So that's basically what the privateers were doing. Now, these privateers would capture any vessel carrying any cargo as long as it had something of value that could deprive the Spanish from it and allow it to go to English holders. And of course, because the Crown took a share of all the privateers' profits, it helped the Crown's revenues as well. And we know, for example, the Dutch, who left us a lot better records of this whole process, wrote a whole chronicle of their early activities in privateering by Johannes de Laat, a famous Dutch chronicler. And the whole chronicle is about, look at all the bad things we did to the Spanish. Look at how much stuff we got from them. Look how much it was worth. And there's a whole appendix at the end which lists the value of all the ships that were captured in gulden, the Dutch currency. And this was what that was all about. The whole beginnings of that process was about damaging them. Now, when they captured slave vessels, and they certainly did capture slave vessels, they didn't take them to Europe, and they didn't take them to any English or Dutch colonies because there weren't any, not in the 1580s and 90s. Instead, when they captured slave vessels, they would take them to sort of remote parts of the Spanish Americas and sell them there illegally, according to the Spanish law. The Spanish law had funneled slaves pretty much to a few ports and a few colonies. And other colonies, the island colonies, for example, Hispaniola, Jamaica, before the English took it in 1655, or the colonies along the coast of Venezuela, they really were starved of slaves by the Spanish crown. So English privateers would carry their ships there and sell the slaves there. And then the profits of that they could carry back as their share of the privateering activities. Only during the very end of that process, in the 1580s, did they think about trying to establish American bases in order, again, to carry this war to the Spanish. Sir Walter Raleigh, who's, my goodness, known to everybody who has anything to do with American settlement by the English, attempted a lot of this colonial activity of building bases. Many people know, of course, of his Roanoke adventure in what became North Carolina in the United States, but he was also active in Guyana and in Trinidad, where he attempted to found colonies as well. None of these colonies were successful. All of them fell to indigenous American counterattacks, they were, for a variety of reasons, not interested in having these types of bases established in their midst. And then in 1609, a truce was signed. The war was temporarily ended, and privateering activity stopped, or at least slowed down. Well, I should say they were redefined as real piracy. It's probably the best way of putting it, because many English and Dutch ports had become committed, really, to this kind of activity. This was their lifeblood, and they needed it, and they wouldn't easily stop. And everybody knew the truce would not hold. As soon as the time was up, they were going to go back to war. This was a given. They were just breathing, really, for it. But during that time, both English and Dutch merchants, having learned about the Spanish Americas and learned the geography of the Americas and its potential for profits, decided they would try to build colonies that would simultaneously serve as military bases or naval bases and be self-sufficient and even revenue generating if they could do it. So they founded the colonies that we know in North America, the Jamestown colony in 1607, and of course Bermuda in 1609. They attempted, less successfully, to do the same thing in the southern Caribbean. An attempt to build one in Grenada failed in 1609, and several on the coast of what's now Suriname also failed in the early 16 teens. So when they returned to war, now we're getting back up to the current minute. When they returned to war in 16, well, it started really sort of 1615, 16. They were sort of earing to go. When they returned to war, they now had a place to take the slaves that they captured. So when the privateers went out again, they began capturing Portuguese vessels again. Instead of taking them to the Spanish areas, they took them to the new emerging colonies that were growing up primarily in North America and in Bermuda. And that would be what would happen to that group. And this is sort of the origin of our founding generation in Virginia, in Bermuda, and elsewhere. Okay, now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, who will carry the story a little bit farther.
What we tried to do as we thought about this world of the English and the Dutch, we wanted to find out exactly where the slaves that the English and the Dutch, if they were not purchasing the slaves in Africa. So if these slaves were not being purchased, they were coming from someplace in Africa. And what we know as Africanists, we both teach African history, and we both do research on Portuguese Africa, including the most important colony for slaves in Portuguese Africa was Angola. And as we conducted this research, and this research was only possible because we had a database of many ships leaving Africa during the time that the Dutch and English were pirating Portuguese ships. What we realized that all the slaves coming from Africa during this particular time that the English and the Dutch were establishing the colonies, they were coming from one place in Africa. They were coming from Angola. All the slaves. So you go to, and we have this, the reason that we were able to do this and ascertain is that the Portuguese in Angola, the governors, held the asiento. The asiento was a contract that the Spanish gave to companies, to individuals, to governors, officials, to in fact be the only ones permitted to send slaves legally to the Spanish colonies. So here we had, in fact, for us, an amazing kind of a, wow, one person found a generation, all these Africans coming from one area in Africa. Now, the interesting thing about this area of Africa is that, in fact, you would see Angola there. Angola is part of Central Africa. All the people in Central Africa basically are identified as Bantu, people who are descended from one particular migration of peoples who originated in Cameroon and then settled, and this 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So what we're saying is that we're not looking at a place like Nigeria, where you would have several different, really distinct, in the north you have the Fulani, in the southeast you have Igbos, in the southwest you have Yorubas and different languages, etc. These people from Central Africa all speak related Bantu languages. In fact, the two specific areas in Angola where we know that there were established kingdoms, the Kingdom of Congo and the Kingdom of Ndongo, where people speaking Kikongo and people speaking Kimbundu. These two languages, they're like Spanish and Portuguese. So they're more or less interchangeable. People, I speak Portuguese, I could understand Spanish, okay? So what we decided to do was to find out exactly what's the cultural makeup, what was happening in this place where all these slaves, whether you were going to North America, Virginia, whether you were going to Bermuda, whether you were going to Barbados, because we have all of this in the book. All of these English and Dutch areas. So we said we have in the book, we have to give the reader some sense of the cultural makeup, some sense of the political dynamics of this area in the time when these people are coming into Bermuda, or they're going to Jamestown, or they're going to Barbados, or they're going down to the Guyanas, wherever the English had these little settlements all along. So what I'm going to do is kind of a read to you, so that you can follow me in more coherent way, because I don't want to give you this little piece of fact and this little piece of fact. I want it to be sequential. The research we conducted concerning the cultural background of the first generation of Africans who came to the Americas during this period. By the way, the Asiento from the 1580s to 1640, the Spanish and Portuguese were under one crown. So that's why Portugal figures prominently in any transaction that the Spanish are having in terms of slaves. The research we conducted concerning the cultural background of the first generation of Africans who came to the Americas, including the first Africans in Bermuda, demonstrate conclusively that these Africans came from present-day Angola. The enslaved Africans originated from 4 political units: the African Kingdom of Congo, with its capital in present-day northern Angola, but with some provinces in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the African Kingdom of Ndongo, stretching from the present-day city of Luanda, which is the present-day capital of Angola, in an easterly direction. The Portuguese Kingdom of Angola, which included the city of Luanda and some settlements along the Kwanza River, and the African Kingdom of Matamba, located to the east of Ndongo and several hundred miles from the coast. The kingdoms of Ndongo and Congo had been fundamentally altered by their integration into the Atlantic world since the Portuguese arrived at the mouth of the River Zaire, or the River Congo, in 1483. Most important was the fact that the many wars the region experienced changed the political map of the region. Slave trading and slave raiding became geared towards supplying the demands of the Atlantic slave trade. And this, in fact, transformed a system of domestic slaveholding, because the Africans in this area had domestic slavery, but these slaves were integrated into the family after generations, and they could not be sold. But because of the new dynamics being integrated into the Atlantic demand for slaves, transformed the very makeup of these African societies. Also, we know that cultural and political developments in the interaction with the Portuguese also transformed these societies, that is Congo or Ndongo and Congo. Congo, and I'm going to start with Congo, is a very interesting country or place for the origins of those first group of Africans. Congo, during the period from 1491 to 1660, this is the period of our book, and the period when by 1650s, Africans from other areas of West Africa are coming in, and they are going to be in the majority, because the first generation of the Central Africans are going to be, getting, in terms of their demographic impact, smaller, and the much larger groups are going to be coming from West Africa. After a Portuguese cultural mission, the Portuguese mission baptized the king of Congo. His name was Nzinga Nkuwu, and he adopted the baptismal name of Juan I, or John I. So in this very early period we are talking about, we have Africans. Christianity is going to be a framework of identity. So for many people it's surprising. That early Christian, 1491. Every Congolese king after that carried Christian names, fought, with battles against their neighbors, saying they are, spreading Christianity, and in fact adopted, really what we would say surprising. It seemed to be some of them are from the Caribbean, just like me or you. That in fact these people who are in Central Africa, who are speaking of Kikongo, also know Portuguese, they know Latin, they go to schools, This is all happening before one slave come to Bermuda, okay? Before one slave go to North America. For instance, in a document found in the records of Antonio Manuel, the Congo ambassador to Rome in 1604, the king advised the Pope that he had made 4 heathen kings Christian, and he identifies all the regions: Kundi, Kala, Okanga, and Zari-Congo. And he requested that the Pope favor him with many privileges because, and I'm quoting here, these are all documents that we find in the records in Angola, in Rome at the Vatican Archives, in Portugal at the Colonial Archives, and in Portuguese archives in Angola. Okay, hear what he says. Send him privileges so that what could he do? So that he could reduce some to the love of our holy laws and others by force with the arm of Christians. This desire to present themselves as Christian monarchs led Alvaro, one of the kings, in 1613 to demand that the priest observe the Roman Catholic ceremonial among his person. Because when the priests came from Italy or Portugal, they were not treating the king in a dignified manner as a Christian king in Europe would be treated. So he was complaining, you treat me as a Christian monarch. Furthermore, in 1619, another king, enlisting his titles, wrote, this is, I, Don Alvaro III, by divine grace, augmenter of the faith of Jesus Christ, and defender of it in this part of Ethiopia, king of the most ancient kingdom of Congo, Angola, Matamba, Okango, and the Ambundu, of this and the other side of the mighty river Zaire. These people knew exactly, these kings knew exactly what their territories were, they knew exactly what their status was, they knew exactly how they wanted the Europeans with whom they had diplomatic, cultural, and political alliances, how they were to be treated. Now, don't forget that this is happening at the same time that slaves are coming out. So you cannot separate. What people have tended to do is to just concentrate on the slaves coming out and disconnect those slaves from the cultural and political reality of what I call, and what John and I call, a Creole society that had emerged in Africa. A Caribbean type, society that had emerged in the context of the opening of the Atlantic and in the context of the exchange of diplomatic and other relations between Europeans and Africans. The Christian identity of Central Africans was evident in the capital city of the kingdom. And this capital city was called Mbanza Congo. That's the original name. Today it goes back to this original name is still in place today, Mbanza Congo. But during the height of the Congo kingdom, it was called San Salvador, Portuguese name, Saint Salvador. Here by the 1580s, a cathedral, I enjoy your beautiful Anglican cathedral today. You go to Central Africa. There is also this cathedral, but guess what? This cathedral predated the cathedral that you have here. You understand what I mean? It predated it. Africans were going to this cathedral. This is a ruin. John and I took this picture when we were in Angola in 2002. And the cathedral, in fact, the Pope celebrated the 500th anniversary of the founding of this cathedral. Which Pope was it? I think John Paul II, when he went to Angola. So I just want to contextualize that when we go back to look at that history, what we are seeing is that people who as they had this interaction with the Portuguese, with the Italian missionaries who were coming, they're Dominicans, they're Jesuits, they're other Capuchins, when they had this relationship, yes, they wanted the exchange, the cultural exchange, the religious exchange, but they wanted it on African terms, because these priests were always complaining. The Africans were not giving up certain practices like polygamy, and they were not really good Christians. But guess what? The priests were saying that about the lower class in Spain with all the witchcraft trials. They were saying that of lower class people. There's always this orthodox approach to religion, and there's a popular approach to religion. In the Congo had their orthodox approach, and what was it? Each Congolese had to be married, right? But each Congolese also wanted to be buried. By the 17th century, the Congolese nobility, who all carried European names, Alfonso, Alvaro, and some people look at this and say, this couldn't be true. How these people, they give up their African names, but they carry both an African name and a European name. They wanted to be buried in the cathedral. All of these were marks of their Christian identity. The city of San Salvador in Banza, Congo, by the 17th century, it had many private chapels where each noble would keep up a private chapel. It had chapters of many of the brotherhoods you have heard of in the Catholic Society, Catholic Church. You have a lot of brotherhoods. It had Brotherhood of the Rosary, Brotherhood, these lay organizations that, in fact, where each member would see to the burial of his, like burial societies. You have that. This was in the Congo. During the same time that you had slaves coming out, you had this, Christian community, Christian society. And we said, well, maybe these Congos were not real Christians because they, maybe it's just the nobility. Not so. When visitors went to the Kingdom of the Congo, they described these people have schools. In the Soyo province in the Kingdom of Congo, there were schools where children were learning Latin. The German visitor who went to the Kingdom of Congo in 1608 and 1611, they commented on this, very surprised that this level of Europeanization, let's say, would be evident in these society in Angola and in the Congo, in what we call present-day Central Africa. Now, you might think that it was only Christianity. That is not the only indicator of the Creole nature of this population. As I said, language was very important. So many of the Congos spoke Portuguese. Some of them knew how to read Latin. The elite were writing letters. These are letters that we have, extracts of letters. You go to Rome, you go to Portugal, and you see literacy was a hallmark of some members of the elite. We are not saying that every Congo who came over were able to read. But we know that there were Congos who came over who had gone to some of those schools. We know that the Angolans, I'm talking about Congo as the example because it's a prime example. But if you go to Angola, you have the same level of exposure, but it's coming to the Angolans or the Kimbundu, that's the next Bantu-speaking population that sent so many slaves over. It's coming to them through the Portuguese, because the Portuguese did not conquer Congo, but the Portuguese conquered part of an Ndongo kingdom, and establish themselves in what is today Luanda, and then use that base to conquer areas and take areas out of the Kingdom of Congo. Now, one of the interesting things and the very important factor in this Portuguese and Ndongo relations is the resistance that was shown by one particular Angolan leader, and that is her coming up. Go back.
This is it?
Yes. Here. Queen Jinga. Has anyone heard of Queen Jinga? Right. Some of you, or one of you may have heard of her. I am not writing a book, a biography of this queen. Here is this woman, a member of the daughter of the king. After the king died, her father, her brother, the Portuguese did not want to see a woman ruling the Ndongo kingdom. Now, before she took office in 1624, she had been exposed to the Portuguese because she had gone on a diplomatic mission to Luanda from the Ndongo, from her capital, from the capital of her sister, of her brother, which was based in more in the interior. She had traveled with her diplomatic, companions to Luanda. And here we see her. She was negotiating a treaty with the Portuguese. Stop the wars. Stop building forts in our territory. Return the slaves that you have taken. The Portuguese were surprised at the extent to which Jinga negotiated a treaty with them, and her boldness and her stature and her, in fact, insistence that if the Portuguese did not give her a chair as the governor, as the one the governor was sitting on, she had chairs. Now you can think that this is really cruel. She called one of her servant maids and sat on the back of the servant maid like if it was a chair, and the governor describes it getting up and down as she negotiated. When she was walking out of that room, the governor called and said, "Have you forgotten your chair?" She turned back and said, "I have many more chairs from where this came from." The Portuguese couldn't believe their eyes. But not only was this woman just remarkable as a diplomat, but as a leader, she was the only African leader who continued to resist the Portuguese until, I would say, until her death in 1663, even though she did negotiate with them a settlement. Because as I am reading her letters, every time, even in the negotiation for her to stop the war with the Portuguese, she insisted she is not subordinating herself to the Portuguese. She never wanted to be seen as to have submitted to the Portuguese. She, as well, was a leader who converted to Christianity, but she was seeing herself also as an African leader. When she died, and John, you have the picture of her death. Yeah, she's buried, as a Christian. But between her burial, this in 1663, and 1622, when she first became a Christian, she was baptized. Can you show them the baptism? She was baptized in Luanda in 1622. When she returns to her home after this baptism, and the Portuguese broke the contract that they had signed with her, she went back to war, and she gave up Christianity. What she did was to use, and she's a very spiritual woman, because when she's not relying on Christian symbols, guess what she's relying on? The African traditional beliefs and rituals. She keeps in a misete, in a box, the bones of her brother. And before she goes to war, she calls on them the ancestors, to give her strength. One of the things she had was she was not going to submit herself to the Portuguese. She wanted, as the kings of Congo, she wanted also to have missionaries come. She did not want the missionaries to come from Portugal. She wanted them to come straight from Rome, because she knows if they come from Rome, they're more independent than if they come from Portugal, they would be representing Portuguese policies. The same thing that the King of Congo did. So and we're talking about now, by the way, I should mention here that both in Angola and in Congo, there are several hundred thousands of Portuguese actually living in Central Africa. So what we have to keep in mind is that Central Africans who are coming into Bermuda, coming into Maryland or Virginia, are being exposed to Portuguese as a political group. They're being exposed to many aspects of the European culture, including, as I said, the religion, but the language, food. They're mixing. This society, these people who are coming from Central Africa, have in fact become what we call in the book a Creole, culture. They have a Creole culture. They are baptizing their children and giving them names like John, Pedro, what we would say 2 first names, but this is a cue for when we come to the Americas and we see naming patterns like that. We said that's a Central African, Congo or Angola naming pattern. When we see people exhibiting preference or not resisting joining churches in Maryland, in Virginia, in New York, and in Bermuda, it's very difficult for us to see some of the patterns, but we believe that what we see in the other areas, that in fact this pattern would have been, similar in Bermuda. Now what we are saying is that those people who are being taken out as slaves during the very period that the English and Dutch are building up their colonies are all coming from this mixed Creole society. We are not insisting that all of the Africans, and if you show your map, the map, John, we are not insisting that all of the Central Africans are exposed to Christianity and to Portuguese and other cultures at the same extent. But what we do see, as we plot where wars were fought to bring out slaves from Central Africa, we see that the wars are being fought in the same areas that this creolization was taking place. So we know that the slaves who are coming out in this period, when the British and Dutch are building up their colonies, are coming from areas that had been more or less exposed to a Creole culture. Religion, Christianity, one of the markers of this. Certain practices with naming. And I would say the third thing, very important, familiarity with Europeans. Familiarity with Europeans. It's not, when they reach to Bermuda, it's not the first time that they'll be seeing a European person. Some of them would have been living next to Portuguese in the settlements that the Portuguese have built up. We believe that this would have made these Africans much more predisposed. And some people have accused us to say, okay, if you're saying that the Africans are more or less, familiar with Europeans, then maybe it's easier for them to become slaves. We are not saying that. What we are saying is that these Africans are going to have the wherewithal to negotiate themselves within a European society, even though they are slaves. So what we have to do when we come to the American side, we have to look and see exactly How do these Africans build communities?
So, back to the Act 2 from me. Okay, now we can really start talking about Bermuda. So we have a nice background on where the Africans are coming from. We've already seen that essentially it's a privateering activity that brings the first generation of Africans to this island. And as it happens, the lead privateer, I guess you might say, in the English service in the early 17th century was certainly Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick. He was a major figure in English privateering. He had gotten himself in huge trouble in 1615 by actually capturing the daughter of the Mughal Emperor of India and holding her for ransom, requiring his government to come out and rescue him from this piece of awkwardness. He had a little bit better luck with that regard in the Atlantic, and his principal privateering base was right here in Bermuda. And Bermudians always know what this is about. You know, it's nicely located out there in the Atlantic. You've got easy access to the Caribbean. Not easy to get to this place from the Caribbean. The Spanish tried to send a fleet up here in 1614, and they failed. The reefs and all of that. I suppose people know that history quite well. They chose this island well for purposes of it being a naval base. And that's really what they were thinking about when they decided to create the island of Bermuda. So what this means is that as the privateers are striking out into the Atlantic in various places, the most likely place to return is to Bermuda. They certainly distributed slaves elsewhere in the English colonies and in the Dutch colonies, but Bermuda got more than anybody else. It wasn't because Bermuda had a dynamic economy, although it was okay. It wasn't because it was drawing slaves to them for anything it was doing, but because this was the center of the activity. And it would be so from 1617 or so, when the English resumed privateering activities, until 1635, when they moved their activities a little bit closer to the Spanish world, to Providence Island, right off the coast of modern-day Nicaragua. And they held up there for 6 years. The trouble with Providence Island was it was too close to the Spanish, and they wiped it out in 1641. Then the piracy, or privateering, depending on which side of this argument you're on, returned to Bermuda. So Captain Jackson, one of the great last privateers of this period, chose to bring his cargoes when he went raiding through the Caribbean in 1645, bringing them back to Bermuda. Okay, so let's take a look at what's probably one of the most famous and best documented of these activities as a sort of a model. And that's the voyage of the Portuguese vessel São João Batista. The São João Batista left Angola, Luanda, Angola, in August of 1619. On this ship were thousands of people, well, 350 people. There were thousands of people who had been captured by the governor of Angola at that moment. Luís Mendes de Vasconcelos, the governor of Angola, had made an unholy alliance with a group of mercenary soldiers that came from the central part of Angola. And he had conducted a huge war, a war which was quite successful. In fact, during the course of his reign, he exported 50,000 people in just 3 years. One of the 30-something ships that left Luanda during his tenure as governor was the São João Batista under Manuel de Cunha. And de Cunha's voyage starts down there, and it moves through here. And then, as you see, about the time, the trouble with this voyage was it was a slow one. And these slaves were packed very densely in the bottom of the ship. Hygienic conditions were bad. Mortality was unfortunately very heavy for these people, so bad that the São João decided to stop in Jamaica instead of continuing to their ultimate destination, which was going to be Veracruz in Mexico. And they had to stop in Jamaica because the conditions had become simply very bad. And indeed, they left 47 slaves in Jamaica who were too sick to continue the voyage. They cleared the many who had died, they cleared the bottoms of the ship, and they resumed their voyage. But as they were just beginning to turn in between the Yucatan and Cuba, here, they were captured by 2 English privateers. There was John Jopes, White Lion, and Daniel Elfreth's treasurer. And because the treasurer was involved in a lawsuit, we know lots and lots of details about his voyage, more than we know of any other ship. And it just so happens that those 2 ships also brought the first slaves to go to Virginia. So in North America, we know the White Lion as the ship that brought the 20-and-odd Negroes, the founding fathers, as it were, of African America. But that ship also left half of its cargo in Bermuda. The treasurer, and here's an interesting story. Alfred held his letter of marque from the Duke of Savoy in northern Italy. Job held his mark from, what's his name? Yeah, from the Netherlands. And when they arrived in Virginia, the people in Virginia were afraid that the letter from Savoy wasn't a legal letter of marque. So they turned that ship away, and it returned to Bermuda, where it found more willing people to take it on. And so, as it happens, the people from the White Lion went to Virginia. The people from the Treasurer ended up going to Bermuda. However, about 10 or 15 of those treasurer slaves were returned to Virginia in 1620. And the only named person that we have from this episode, a young woman named Angela, was actually raising pigs in Virginia in 1625 on the muster list. And so we have her name as one of the survivors of the San Juan Bautista. Now, many of her shipmates on that ship, many of the people who probably came pretty much from the same villages in the area around Masangano in modern-day Angola, and anybody who goes to North America, if you go to Virginia and you go to the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation's exhibit at Jamestown, you'll see the film, which Dr. Haywood and I were instrumental in organizing, and we took the film crew right to Masangano. We had the local people in that area build a village on the 17th century model, not like the one they live in now. They have different houses, better houses, I guess, more modern houses. But they built round pattern houses with conical roofs, sort of like these here, right? And we did some filming there with all local people. Interestingly enough, everybody in that film was Angolan, including the people who played the Portuguese, because they have Portuguese in Angola still. So in any case, that sort of is the nutshell of what happened many, many times. These voyages are not well documented, unfortunately. The English ones are not very well documented. The Dutch, much better. We love the English in many ways, but they just aren't very good at keeping records. And this has been unfortunate for us because when we want to do the history of Afro Bermudians, we're stuck with the fact that the Spanish didn't settle here. Because the Spanish had some horrible institutions which historians love. One of them was the Inquisition. The Inquisition would take some poor soul and interview her for 900 pages. And during that time, she would tell you every cousin that she had and every ancestor that she had and everything she did for the last 6 months and where she went and what she did and all of that. And you just get huge masses of information on what the ordinary life of Africans was in the Spanish Americas because of this problem. Even if it has nothing to do with whatever witchcraft or blasphemy or heresy she was accused of or he was accused of, there's just huge records for that. And so we can learn so much about people in those areas. The English didn't do this. Okay, so in any case, what we can say, however, there's 2 points that we can make pretty sure. The first of these is that this was a very homogeneous first generation, right from the beginning in 1617 or 1615, depending on how we're counting, through to about 1640. And that's about the time that really we stop having the privateering, but it's also about the time we stop getting an African group coming to Bermuda. It's a very homogeneous group. They speak just 2 closely related languages. Both have very close connections with Portuguese, and they are a part of what Linda has just described here as a Creole culture. So they are simultaneously easily able to communicate with each other, and they have a lot of areas in which they understand where they're from. Now, what makes Bermuda really unusual, in fact unique amongst American societies, is that it had a large African-born population without a plantation economy. This is actually a very important phenomenon. It's an accident. It's because the Earl of Warwick had his headquarters here. It's not because they had a great sugar revolution as they did in Barbados. If you look at Virginia and Barbados, 2 good model colonies to be like Bermuda, both of those colonies had only 2, 3, or 4% of their population of African descent in the 1640s. And then the sugar revolution hit, and the tobacco revolution hit. And between those 2 great cash crops, they started importing thousands of Africans. So that the bulk of the population in both of those islands descends not from this charter generation, that group that came in with the privateers. They weren't very numerous. But rather with this massive group that came when the English started up the slave trade. And those people focused their attention on West Africa, not on Central Africa. That was the circumstance of the slave trade. Bermuda actually went the other direction. When tobacco failed as a cash crop here, Bermudians didn't have the wherewithal to participate in this massive slave trade. As privateering dropped off as an activity with the end of the wars in 1648, Treaty of Westphalia, they were no longer really on the front edge of privateering. But here's what had happened in Bermuda instead. First of all, they had a fairly large population. We think about 20% of the Bermudian population in the beginning of this period, we're talking about roughly middle of the 1620s, early 1630s, were probably of African ancestry. We don't have a good solid basis for that. We know that when the 1663 or so, 1684 enumeration, they were about a quarter of the population. And we think they probably had reached that proportion pretty soon. What we do see, though, is some interesting things. First of all, unlike most plantation societies, Bermuda did not have high rates of mortality and low rates of nativity. Again, we don't have a lot of good statistics on this, but we do know that families formed very early. We know that already the owners of Afro Bermudians were complaining that they had a lot of children, okay, which is characteristic of a population that's growing rather than shrinking. And therefore, we think that probably on this island, more people are descended from the charter generation than you would meet in any other American colony. And therefore, looking out of those of you who have African ancestry, I'm willing to bet, and I'm hoping I'm right, most of your ancestors would have come here from Angola, and they would have come here in the 17th century. Now, if people start doing DNA swabs and so on, you know, we may have to back off from that one. But this is what we think is the situation. It really looks that way. So, another thing that I think is significant is that Bermuda, unlike plantation economies, didn't develop a geographical separation between the African-born population or their descendants and the European population. We know they lived cheek by jowl, often in the same houses, usually in the same houses. We also know that if you got, this is Norwood's map. This is a 1663 map. It's hard to see the details on this, but maybe you may know this. Norwood in this map, unlike his 1622 map, put houses on here. And we're guessing that Norwood, being a surveyor, probably did put the houses in the right place. And what you see here would not surprise anybody. The houses are all along the shore. They're all clustered around waterways, okay, which means that basically this population, whatever their ownership status is, and each owner, 2, 3 slaves, we know that was the situation, they're living next to each other. They're shouting distance from each other. So, and there's a lot of social distance, in spite of, you know, sort of some popular mythology. There's still a lot of social distance in those days between people of African ancestry and people of European ancestry, even probably lower class people. We can't prove that with documents that we would like to, but we know that certainly the attitude of the officials towards the African population was a harsh one. It was a one that limited opportunities, and that tends to drive people together, being the end of that end of. So we think that there was probably a good deal of that culture that came to this island. Now, what's interesting to us, and it's the same problem that we see when we go to Brazil, and that is that in Brazil, in many parts of Brazil, Angolans made up a huge percentage of the population as well. This was right across the Atlantic. It was a Portuguese colony and all of that. And the Africans seem to disappear because they have a very similar culture. They have Christianity, they have literacy, they're into this whole process, so they don't look different. But they are different in many respects, and they carry with them that culture from Africa. We think the same thing happens here.
One of the things I also want to point out is that I'm from the Caribbean, I'm from Trinidad, and what I notice about the Bermudian society is that, you know, we in the rest of the Caribbean you can sense an African culture, and I come here and I'm saying I'm looking for that, and I'm not seeing it. And it dawned on me that, in fact, what you had was from day one, people are, in fact, I'm not saying finding themselves comfortable, but they are able to negotiate a living space within, even within the confines of slavery. And I'm not saying that slavery was less harsh here in, you know, Bermuda, but what I'm saying is that those Africans who came, those first Africans who come from Angola and Congo area, that they had been living with Europeans. They were accustomed. This was not your African so-called from the interior who had never seen a European before. So they were not afraid. They were not hesitant to find some means of communication with other with indentured servants who were here. And we know there were large numbers of indentured servants as well. So I think when we think about Bermuda, I think from the very beginning, you had achieved some form of cultural unity, if not, obviously, racial and other class. And the two things I see, I think Bermudian, for me, the culture, see, everybody, you know, whether you're white or black, you're part of that culture. But then, as a you know, visitor here, there's a space, there's also a distance based on, you know, based on things like, you know, class, based on color, but the culture is unified, and one wonders if that culture from the very beginning had in fact been created, because you had African Creoles and you had Europeans who, as they came into the Americas, they became Creoles too. Whites became Creolized, and so therefore you had a Creole population. But you have to remember, the black Creoles did not get the opportunity. They did not get the education. They did not get the residential. There were lots of attempts, and in fact, to throw out. You know, if the black population increased too much, free population, get out. So all of these things, I think Bermudians have to come to terms with that kind of a common cultural heritage, but also recognize some of the contradictions, you know, in terms of race, class. That's for me. This is just my commentary on how I see, as a Caribbean person, you know, I see this society. And as someone who has lived in America for 40-odd years, I also, and someone who is very sensitive to culture, to being an outsider, insider. So I'm really happy that we have had this opportunity to sort of go back to the very origins, be at comfort level with that African society. It's an African society that was trying on its own to be part of the Atlantic world on its own terms. But that because of colonialism, slavery, and the factional wars, because there were lots of wars within Congo that led free Congolese and free Angolans to be enslaved and taken to Brazil and taken to Bermuda and taken to Virginia and the like. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, we hope that you'll have some questions for us, and we're prepared, we think, to answer them. So thank you very much.
Yes.
The Ethiopians had a huge kingdom back then, and it was much larger than the current day Ethiopia. And that kingdom was Christian, because they were Jewish before they became Christian. And I'm not sure the date they became Christian, but I understood that the Ethiopians were Christian. It was probably the first Christian nation. I know ahead of anybody in Europe, as a whole country. A lot of people don't realize that. How much influence did that Christianity from Ethiopia have on Central Africa? And I know it spread into parts of, I thought it spread into parts of the Congo, Ethiopia in those days. Now, maybe it's not. I know it was huge, but I'm not sure. But do you think there was any influence of Christianity from the Ethiopians down to Africa?
No.
No, there wasn't. However, beginning in the 1580s, the kings of Congo had learned of the existence of the kingdom of Ethiopia through their connections in Rome. And as a result, they undertook a diplomatic mission through Rome to make contact with the king of Ethiopia. The maps of the 17th century didn't show the width of Africa accurately. And so when you looked at a map that was drawn by a European cartographer, say 1620 or so, it looked as though the boundaries of Ethiopia were just a little bit beyond
Yes.
the boundaries of Congo. Both Congolese and Portuguese were confused by this, and they thought, well, maybe just, just past the next. It turned out to be 1,500 miles, but on the map it looked like it was a lot less than that. They didn't have MapQuest, I guess. So they actually did a diplomatic mission, an Ethiopian mission, also in Rome. They had some contacts. They didn't actually follow it all the way through and exchange ambassadors, but that was certainly in the works, at least in the early 1610s.
Yeah, and some of the missionaries believed that they could, in fact, get to Ethiopia from the Congo, area. So the thinking was that the two countries were much nearer. But Ethiopia, as you know, it's 300s AD that it became the same. A few years after Rome converted to Christianity, the Ethiopian converted to Christianity as well. The Congo region was the first region in Africa south of the Sahara to convert to Christianity. It was an unusual event because the Portuguese had been attempting to convert other areas of West Africa, and this was the first area where the king, the court, went gung-ho on the conversion and then insisted that, in fact, the entire society, bring cultural mission, bring teachers, bring priests, everyone should become a Christian. Some people might see that, again, as a political, whatever was happening in Congo at the time, maybe it was very convenient for the king of Congo to, in fact, take that particular strategy.
I'm not sure how this is a question, but we have what we call the Gombe today, or the Gumba, and art historians and historians like Cyril trace them directly to West Africa, to Guinea, Mali, Northern Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso. They have survived the centuries. Why is it that we see this side of African culture as opposed to Angola?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as we say, this is the Brazil problem.
Yeah.
You don't see.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, the question had to do with why is it that Gombe has survived here as an African cultural element, and we don't see cultural elements from Central Africa. Is that right?
Yes, and some
As a nutshell.
Yeah, and also the scholars who have worked on it identified as having a West African origin.
Yeah. Well, we think that's probably accurate. In other words, what we see when we look at Gombe costumes and dances and so on, they don't look Central African to us. I know there's been an attempt to connect the word Gombe to Goma, which is the Kikongo and Kimbundu word for dance and celebration, but the B gives us big trouble, so I don't think it's the same word. And the costumes to us, to be honest, it looks like the Lower Niger. Yeah. But these things are creolized between African groups in the Americas as well as over time. So there's many, many things that can make any manifestation of African culture in America not look like any particular African culture because Africans talk to each other. And many parts of the Americas, remember, people from different ethnic groups would be mixed together in the same plantation, and they'd swap. And what would come up would have an African feel to it, but not necessarily an exact thing.
So, I mean, it is so strong.
Yeah.
I saw the snake, the dance in Northern Cote d'Ivoire. It's an exact replica of what you see here in Bermuda.
Okay.
But what we attempted to show you when we did the African background is that if you have people who are coming from these zones that are already creolized and coming in, yes, they are bringing some elements of Africa, but they're not coming into an African society, they're coming into a Creole society. So that transition from Africa to Creole, it's easier for that group. And all of them are coming, they speak the same languages, Kikongo, Kimbundu. They're more or less have been exposed to some of the same types of cultural indices that you would not see for that very early group from 1616, your first African arrived, but for us the 1619 is the one until 1640. Bermuda is not important after about 1630s. any large numbers of Africans. There are some Africans that are coming in, but it's that first group that we are saying form the foundation, and they already have this Creole background. The same thing as Dr. Thornton said, in Brazil, where these Africans, you are not seeing as much of that Central African culture. We are arguing that it's because it's already begun the process in Africa of transforming, of being more an Atlantic culture than just a specific African culture.
Yeah. Can I just add one more thing? I think that's relevant here. And again, this is something that you see in many places in the Americas. A lot of the most African-looking things, they look African to us because they look exotic and different. And many times they turn up having shown up late in the game. But what I think is interesting is in any cultural phenomenon, especially one that has an aesthetic component, 2 or 3 people that are really good can make a huge difference. And just as you think, for example, if you have a musical tradition that goes along, and then you have a really brilliant musician who changes everything, and it could be one person. In a cultural phenomenon, especially one like an artistic phenomenon, it could be a small group of people whose particular contribution is so striking, everybody just jumps in on it. So the processes of how aesthetic things, develop over time are not dependent upon demographics per se. And again, I think what we have to recognize is that, as we see in Brazil, Central African culture seems to disappear because it is a Creole culture that is already there.
One other item here, one can suggest that when the groups come later, following the Central Africans, there are Africans coming in some areas of the Americas until the 19th century. In Brazil, that Yoruba culture with congadas and so that we all see, that group only comes in the 19th century. So their culture is much more evident because it comes in at a much later time, and larger groups of that community are coming in and are reinforcing that culture. So in fact, you have sort of neo-African cultural elements, because by the latter part of the 19th century, the Brazilian, who are Yorubas, are sending to Brazil to be trained in Yoruba, spiritual beliefs, and then reinforcing those practices in Brazil. By the 20th century, academics choose this to study, so they become the marker for Brazilian culture. And then they do not study the Central African ones, because the Central African ones are not that distant from the European Creole culture. So I think these are ideas that one has to keep in mind in terms of why don't I see that and I see the other thing. Hope that helps.
Okay, let's go with the white.
I was wondering, prior to the Portuguese invasion or connection with the Congo, did you study or research what Congo culture was like? And then was there a comparison to this Creole society that was created from the interaction? Was there any study in the psychological, political, or cultural effect that the interaction had on this new society that was created?
Well, first of all, the Portuguese arrived in Central Africa in 1483. That's a long, long time ago. And prior to the arrival of literate Portuguese observers, we don't have any local documentation. So we have to rely on archaeology, and we have to rely on comparative ethnography, oral tradition, that sort of thing, to try to understand what the original religion was like. And I guess in part, it's interesting that the entire first half of the 16th century, the documentation that we have from it comes only from Congo writers. In other words, it's the Congos who start writing their history. And we don't get the Portuguese voice. I mean, it's sort of a strange way of thinking of it. And what they tell us from their perspective, and these are the people who have just become Christians or the second generation or so on, they're giving us that first blast. But let me just give you some thoughts on this. One of the things we did was we took a look at people who were not a part of the Kingdom of Congo, but were from related cultures that weren't touched by this phenomenon. And we tried to look at how their cultures were, and see what similarities there might be between the original Congo culture. So we look at Luango, which is a kingdom on the north coast that didn't become Christian. They speak the Kikongo language, but they weren't a part of the kingdom. And we take a look at how they looked at their ancestors, what sort of ancestral traditions they had. They also had what they called territorial deities, which would be a god that would be responsible for one area, and another one would be the next area over. And we saw how, for example, the Congolese would take that in. For example, with regards to the ancestor worship, Congolese were very interested in All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day. And they would have, this was the biggest holiday of the year. People would go to the graveyards where their ancestors were buried. They would say Mass. They would stay out all night lighting candles and being with their ancestors in that way. And then in the morning they would say Mass again. So that would be All Saints' Day and Halloween and All Saints' Day. That was one way that it was done.
And some of the terms, for instance, the language, Kikongo, the place for grave, the place for certain places that are central to the Congolese would be referred to in Kikongo words. So that way there's some maintenance of a Kikongo. For instance, when the missionaries were doing a Kikongo dictionary, they relied on the Congo to tell them what do we call a priest. So he said Nganga. So in the Congo word, the priest is Nganga. Who was the Nganga? The Nganga is a term for the traditional religious practitioner. So these are ways in which I think we know that there are elements of the pre-existing Kikongo culture that is maintained. I have this picture here, illustration, which also shows we know that certain patterns on the clothes of the Congolese that you can recognize the Central African pattern. For instance, here, the zigzag, you can talk about it, yeah.
The zigzag is here. The interesting thing about the zigzag, we don't have a picture of it here, but in the 18th century, Congolese began casting a lot of religious sculpture. Yeah. And they have Jesus as an African, and physically he looks as an African. But what's significant about him is that he's wearing a loincloth while he's hanging on the cross there with that same zigzag on it, which identifies him as a Congo.
Right.
In 1704, Donna Beatrice, who I wrote my book about, was possessed by St. Anthony.
Yes.
And while she was in the state of possession, she went frequently to visit heaven. And then when she returned to earth, she would explain to people that actually the Virgin Mary was born in Sundi province, and she was from the Marquis of Mpangi's family. Yeah. And they sort of nationalized the whole Holy Family in that way. Now, she was actually burned by the king as a heretic and witch, so that specific manifestation of Congo religion wasn't accepted. But when you look at the religious art, you realize that Congos did, in fact, really believe that Christianity was their religion. They would say that when God created the world, he started with the kingdom of Congo and sent his angels out to create the rest of the world so he could just devote himself to Congo.
Yeah. I just want to go back to that pattern that we found. Here's a representation of the Antonio Manuel, who was the ambassador of the kingdom of Congo to Rome. And you can see the pattern that he's wearing. And it's very much, even though he has European type covering, that pattern is there. So we know that there are ways in which the Congos and the Central Africans, Queen Jenga and her people, also kept elements of their culture. So I don't know if that answers your question.
You mentioned that Bermuda was not a plantation society, and I missed, I think, why you said that there were so many enslaved Africans that were brought here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what I was getting at is, let's say if we take Barbados for example, and you look at Barbados before 1650 or so, the only Africans they had were the handful of people that had been brought by various privateers, and Barbados was not a place that privateers went very often. And then when they turned over to sugar, and sugar generated huge profits, the Barbadians really led the British into the slave trade. It was Barbadian ships that first started going to Star of London, although it's a London ship, The first known slave ship of an English territory went to Calabar in 1641 to purchase slaves. And then they started, I mean, literally within a few years, they were bringing in 3, 4, 5, 6, 700 people every year, 1,000. And the Barbadian population was completely transformed, largely by West Africans. That's because the profitability of sugar allowed them to purchase thousands and thousands of people. Bermuda did not benefit from that type of thing. When tobacco failed, they didn't have a cash crop that could bring in thousands of people.
So
the only
it was a plantation society, i.e. it was too backward, that was...
I say too poor
Yeah.
rather than too backward.
No, but I think in terms of that swift transition from having very few slaves or slaves that, you know, were 20% to a society where you have slaves 60%, 70% of the population. That type of transformation was not evident here in Bermuda, but was in many Caribbean countries and in places like Virginia and the U.S. South, etc.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
I just want to come back to the Gambia question. We do know that in certainly modern Bermuda history, there has been an influx of persons of Kittitian origin that we know are connected to the Gambia culture and tradition. And I'm wondering if you've come across, or perhaps it's something for you to look at in the future, there were persons of the Congo Angolan ancestry that went to St. Kitts. Is that something that happened or didn't happen? Or?
St. Kitts' history, or St. Christopher's
St.
history.
Christopher, yeah.
We know the place of St. Christopher.
Yeah.
St. Kitts'
We have
history
some.
is similar to that of
Yes.
Barbados. In other words, they had a small
Yeah.
group of Africans at the very beginning, and then they got into sugar, and they just transformed that society. Now, throughout the period of the slave trade, Central Africans were always in the mix. And it varied. I mean, in South Carolina, in the early 18th century, it was 40% of those people were also from Central Africa. So there were places where you still had huge influxes from one area or another. And they're always a part of it.
Yeah.
Another theory that we would work on is what role those Christians would have in creating the Great Awakening in North America and so on, and that's something to be investigated. But if I can just say one more thing here. One of the problems that we face in reconstructing the history of the African population in Bermuda in particular, but generally in English colonies, is we don't have a lot of people who are describing cultural phenomena. It's great to have a traveler who comes in and sits around. For example, when Richard Ligon goes to Barbados in 1649, you know, he takes some time to tell you what's going on in this society. When we look at Bermuda, what we see is court records, land records, deeds, and these are very limited slices of information. And those things usually don't tell you about cultural phenomena, unless you're in a Spanish country where they have the Inquisition that looks into these things.
Well, what we tried to do in the book was to say, okay, we are going to provide readers of this book with some place to start for looking. So we have an appendix, and every named African we found in the records, we have here. So we have